The envelope was already open when I walked into the room. It was sitting on my father's desk, the big oak one he'd had since before I was born, and my sister was standing next to it with her arms crossed, not reading it, just waiting. Like she already knew what was in it. Like the reading of it was just a formality they were getting through before moving on to something else. Something that didn't include me. My father looked up. He didn't say hello. He said, "Close the door, would you?" I closed it. There were 3 chairs in front of that desk. My sister was already in one. The other 2 were empty. I sat in the nearest one and looked at the envelope, and looked at my father and understood. The way you understand things in your body before your mind catches up. That whatever was happening in this room had started long before today. My name is Vivian. I am 53 years old, and the morning my father read that will out loud, I was the only person in the room who hadn't already heard it. My father was not a cruel man. I want to say that first, because what I'm about to describe could make him sound like one, and the truth is more complicated than that. He was a man who had a favourite, and he never thought of it as favoritism. He thought of it as recognizing potential. He thought of it as being practical. He thought, I believe, that he was doing what good fathers do, pouring his energy into the child most likely to carry something forward. That child was my sister, Renee. Renee was 4 years younger than me and had my mother's eyes and my father's confidence, which is a combination that tends to go far in this world. She was charming in rooms I found exhausting. She remembered names, told the right stories at the right moments, laughed at the right times. At family dinners, my father would angle his chair slightly toward her without seeming to notice he'd done it. The way a plant turns toward light. Automatic, unconscious, real. I remember a Thanksgiving when I was maybe 14. I had spent the afternoon helping my mother in the kitchen, while Renee sat in the living room with my father and his brother watching football. When dinner was finally on the table, my father said grace, and then looked at Renee and said, "Tell Uncle Pete about that essay you wrote, the one your teacher kept." Renee told the story. Everyone laughed. I passed the sweet potatoes and didn't say anything, because I had written an essay that same semester that my English teacher had submitted to a regional competition. I had won 3rd place. I had a small certificate in my room in a frame my mother had bought at the drugstore. Nobody had asked me about it once. That was not the worst thing. The worst things were smaller than that. The year I got into the honours programme at my university, my father's response was a nod and, "Good, keep it up." 3 months later, when Renee got a call back for a local news segment she'd pitched as part of a college project, he drove 4 hours to watch it live. He took photographs. He framed one of them. It hung in his office for 11 years. I don't think he knew he was doing it. That's the part that stays with me. He wasn't sitting in a room somewhere, deciding to wound me. He was just living in a world where Renee was the story worth telling, and I was the background it happened against. My mother was softer about it, but she followed his lead the way she had always followed his lead. She would come to my school events, sit in the bleachers, clap at the right moments. But she would talk about Renee on the drive home. What Renee had said that morning. What Renee was planning. How Renee reminded her of her own sister, who had always been so alive in a room. I would look out the passenger window at the dark highway and think that I too was alive in a room. Just apparently not the kind of alive that anyone needed to mention. There were years I told myself it was birth order. Younger siblings are novelties, I read somewhere. They get more photographs, more attention, more grace for their failures. I told myself that and mostly believed it, until I was 31 and helped my father reorganise his garage on a Saturday, because he'd asked me to, not Renee, because Renee had plans. I spent 4 hours moving boxes of old tax files and holiday decorations in a garage that smelled like motor oil and cedar. And when I was done, my father shook my hand, like I was a contractor. On the drive home, I thought, this is what I am to them. Useful, available, the one who comes when called and leaves when the work is done, and doesn't need to be thanked because she doesn't expect anything anyway. I had spent 3 decades teaching them that. The mistake was mine as much as theirs. I just didn't understand that yet. The first sign was so small, I almost dismissed it entirely. About 8 months before my father got sick, Renee started calling him more. That sounds like nothing. Daughters call their fathers. People grow closer as parents age. I know that. But there was something in the frequency that felt off to me. Something in the way my father would mention those calls in passing, almost carefully, like he was making sure I knew they were happening without quite explaining why. Renee and I had a long talk last night, he'd say. About what? Oh, just things. The property, what to do with it eventually. She has some ideas. I didn't push. That was my pattern. Don't push, don't make it uncomfortable, don't be the difficult one. But the property comment stayed with me. My father owned a house on 11 acres outside of town. The house he'd built with his own hands in his late 30s. The one he'd always said would stay in the family. He'd mentioned it to me once, years ago, in the vague way people mention things they assume are understood. You girls will figure it out when the time comes. That was the whole conversation. I had not thought much about it since. Now I started thinking about it. Around the same time, I noticed that my father had a new attorney. He'd used the same man, a semi-retired local guy named Walt, for 30 years. Tax stuff, a simple will, nothing complicated. But one evening, I stopped by to drop off groceries, and there was a business card on the kitchen counter from a firm in the city. Estate planning and asset structuring, the card said. Full service. I picked it up. I set it back down. I didn't say anything. I told myself it made sense. He was 71. It was responsible for updating documents. People did this. A few weeks later, I called to check in on a Tuesday evening, and he didn't pick up. That was normal. I called again Wednesday morning, and he answered, but sounded distracted. Said he had someone coming by later, and he'd call me back. He didn't call me back. When I finally reached him Thursday, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that Renee had been staying with him for a few days. She's helping me with some paperwork, he said. What kind of paperwork? Just things that needed sorting. That was all he offered, and I didn't ask more because asking more felt, in our family, like an accusation, like not trusting people, like making something out of nothing. I had spent my whole life trying not to make something out of nothing, and it had cost me more clarity than I can calculate. The last thing I noticed, the one that finally made my stomach go tight and stay that way, was a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. I was at my father's house in December, in the kitchen making soup while he rested. His cell phone was on the counter charging. It rang, and I glanced at the screen to see if it was someone he'd want to wake up for. The name on the screen was the estate attorney from the city card. I did not answer it. I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand and listened to it ring until it stopped. That night, driving home, I kept both hands on the wheel and tried to remember the last time my father had mentioned my name in the same sentence as the property. I couldn't. My father had a stroke in February. Mild, the doctors said, which is a word that does a lot of work when someone you love is lying in a hospital bed with one side of his face pulled slightly wrong. I was there within 2 hours of getting the call. I sat with him through the first night, held his hand while he slept, talked to the nurses, and asked the questions that needed asking. Renee arrived the next morning with a rolling suitcase and an energy that filled the room immediately. She kissed my father on the forehead. She charmed the floor nurse within 10 minutes. She brought good coffee from the place down the street and set a cup in front of me without asking how I took it, so it had cream when I don't take cream. But I drank it anyway, because that is what I do. My father was discharged after 6 days. During those 6 days, I slept in the chair beside his bed 2 nights, drove 40 minutes home to shower and change, and drove back. Renee stayed at the hotel across the street with the good pillows. She said her back couldn't handle the chairs. I didn't say anything about my back. What happened on the 4th day is what I keep coming back to. The estate attorney came to the hospital. My father had apparently requested it. I was in the hallway, getting water from the fountain at the end of the corridor, when I turned around and saw a man in a grey suit carrying a leather portfolio walking into my father's room. Renee was already inside. I walked back and stood in the doorway, and my father looked at me and said, "Give us just a few minutes, honey." Honey. He hadn't called me that in years. I stood in that hallway for 22 minutes. I counted them on my phone. A nurse asked if I needed anything. I said no. I looked at the wall and listened to the sound of the ventilation system and tried to remember how to breathe normally. When the attorney came out, he nodded at me with the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned not to make eye contact in hospitals. Renee came out behind him. She looked at me and said, "Dad's tired. You should probably head home and get some rest. I'll stay tonight." I looked at her for a moment. "I'm fine," I said. "Vivian." She said my name like a period at the end of a sentence. I went home. I told myself it was because my father needed rest. I told myself that for about 3 days before I admitted, quietly, alone in my kitchen at 11 at night, that I had just been managed out of the room where something important had happened. And I had let it happen. My father came home from the hospital on a Thursday. By the following Monday, he was well enough to sit in his chair in the living room and watch the news and eat the soup I brought in a container because I had learned long ago that he preferred my cooking to Renee's, but would never say so out loud, because saying so would have required acknowledging something he'd spent decades carefully not acknowledging. I was there that Monday afternoon when he asked me to sit down. Not at the kitchen table, in the living room, across from his chair. That was unusual. My father conducted most of his serious conversations at the kitchen table. The living room was for watching television and receiving guests. When he pointed to the couch and said, "Sit down," something in my chest went carelessly. He told me he had updated his estate documents while he was in the hospital. He said it the way someone says they've changed their cable plan. Informational. Settled. Already done. I asked what that meant, specifically. He looked at the television for a moment, even though it was off. Then he looked at me and said that the property, the house and the 11 acres, was going to Renee. He said she had a plan for it. He said she understood what he wanted done with it and had the energy to carry it out. He said he knew I was busy with my own life and he didn't want to burden me. I stay very still. I asked about the will. He said the will had been updated too, that Renee would serve as executor, that the financial accounts would be divided, but the property itself, the thing of actual weight and history, was hers. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm proud of it, but because I think people expect crying in these moments, and what I actually felt was something colder than grief. Something more like confirmation. The thing you feel when a suspicion you've been carrying for years turns out to be true, and you realise some part of you already knew, and had been hoping you were wrong. I asked him when he had made this decision. He said he and Renee had talked about it over the past several months. Several months. While I was driving 40 minutes to move boxes in September, while I was wiring money to cover things quietly, while I was sitting in a hospital chair for 2 nights counting the ceiling tiles. I asked if he had considered talking to me about it before it was done. He said he didn't think it would be an issue. I want you to sit with that for a moment. He didn't think it would be an issue. Not that he'd considered it and made a decision. He simply hadn't imagined I would have a response worth factoring in. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for a while, not going inside. The engine ticked as it cooled. A neighbour walked a dog past the end of my street. Normal afternoon sounds, ordinary Thursday light. The kind of day that doesn't know anything significant just happened. Here is what I knew by the time I walked into my house. I knew my father had been meeting with that attorney for months. I knew Renee had been present for those meetings. I knew I had been kept outside of them, not by accident, not by poor communication, but by design. And I knew that somewhere in those documents was a version of our family story that had been written without my chapter. What I didn't know yet was that Renee had done more than influence those meetings. I found that out 4 days later. My father had a home caregiver who came 3 times a week, a quiet woman named Beatrice, who had been coming to the house for almost a year. I had hired her. I had interviewed 3 people, checked references, set up the schedule, and paid the first 2 months out of my own pocket while my father's accounts were being reorganized after the stroke. Beatrice called me on a Friday morning. She said she wanted me to know something. She said she'd been thinking about whether to call for a few days and had decided she had to. She said that during one of her visits, she had overheard a conversation she didn't think I knew about. I pulled over. She told me that 6 weeks before my father's stroke, Renee had sat in that kitchen with the estate attorney and walked through a property transfer structure designed to move the 11 acres out of the estate entirely before probate. Not a bequest, a transfer. The kind that, if executed correctly, wouldn't require my agreement or my signature because I had never been listed as a co-owner. The kind that was already in motion. I called Renee that same evening. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't a strategy, not yet. It was something more reflexive than that. Some old habit of trying to keep things smooth, of giving people the chance to explain themselves before I decided what to think. 20 years of being the reasonable one doesn't dissolve overnight. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been expecting the call. I told her I'd heard about the property transfer structure. I kept my voice level. I said I wasn't calling to fight. I just wanted to understand what was happening. There was a pause. Then she said, "Dad asked me to help him organise things. That's all this is." "A pre-probate transfer isn't organising things," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "You've always been so suspicious, Vivian. This is exactly why Dad didn't want to involve you. He knew you'd make it adversarial." There it was, the move I should have seen coming. I had made it adversarial. By asking a question. By existing in the conversation at all. She kept going. Her voice stayed even, almost gentle, the way someone speaks when they've rehearsed. She said our father was aging and needed stability, not conflict. She said I had my own life, my own career, that I'd never shown much interest in the property anyway. She said she was the one who'd been showing up, the one who understood what he needed, and that it wasn't fair for me to swoop in now and create problems when I hadn't been present. I hadn't been present. I thought about the 2 nights in the hospital chair, the grocery runs, the caregiver I had hired and paid for, the boxes in the garage on a cold Saturday in September. I thought about all of it, and I said nothing, because I was still, at that moment, operating under the old rules. The ones where I absorbed the accusation and turned it over quietly, and wondered if maybe, somewhere in it, she had a point. She did not have a point, but it would take me another 48 hours to stop entertaining the possibility. What came next was the part that clarified everything. 3 days after that phone call, my father called me himself. His voice was tired, thinner than it used to be. He said Renee had told him I was upset about the estate arrangements. He said he hoped I would trust his judgment. He said he needed peace right now, that the stress wasn't good for his recovery, and that he was asking me, as his daughter, to let this go. He was asking me to let it go. Not to discuss it, not to be heard, to let it go. For his peace, for the family's stability, for all the reasons that had always been used to manage my silence. And then, quietly, he said, "You've always been the strong one. I know you'll understand." I've always been the strong one. That sentence had followed me my entire life, like a hand on my shoulder that looked like a compliment and functioned like a lid. You're strong enough to handle less. You're strong enough to need nothing. You're strong enough to disappear quietly when the room gets rearranged. I told him I loved him. I told him to rest. I hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and I thought very clearly, for the first time without flinching, about what I was actually going to do. I didn't start with a lawyer. I started with a notepad. I sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold before I was halfway through the first page. And I wrote down everything I could remember. Dates, conversations, amounts. The $3,200 I had wired to cover a shortfall Renee had 3 years ago that she'd never mentioned repaying. The 2 months of caregiver fees I'd paid out of pocket. The grocery runs, the hospital nights, the garage Saturday. I wrote it all down, in the order it happened, as specifically as I could remember it, because I had learned from working in systems that the details are where the truth lives. Vague claims disappear. Specifics stay. Then I called Patrice. I asked her if she would be willing to write down what she had heard, in her own words, on her own time, with no pressure from me. I told her I wasn't asking her to testify to anything. I just wanted to know if she'd be willing to put it on paper. She said she'd been thinking about it since she called me. She said she'd have something for me by Wednesday. She did. 3 handwritten pages. Dates, the names she'd heard mentioned, the specific language about the transfer structure, the timeline. Beatrice had a precise memory and a deep sense of what was right, and she wrote it all down in the plainest language possible. It was more useful than anything I could have asked for. Then I went to the county records office. Property transfers, even ones structured to move ahead of probate, leave a trail. Filing dates, instrument numbers, notary stamps. I requested the public documents on my father's parcel and sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and read through them slowly. The transfer documents had been initiated 5 weeks before my father's stroke. Not after, before. When he was, by all appearances, in reasonable health and of sound mind. Which meant the stroke had not prompted the planning. The planning had already been underway. That detail mattered. I wrote it down. I also found something I had not expected. My name appeared in an earlier version of the property deed, a document from 11 years ago, when my father had briefly considered adding both daughters to the title before deciding against it. That version had been superseded. but the record of it existed. The record showed that at one point, he had considered it differently. I made a copy of everything. By the end of that week, I had a folder. Not a dramatic one, no smoking gun, no single revelation that unlocked everything at once. Just a careful, dated, documented account of what had happened and when, and in what order. That folder was the first thing that was entirely mine. I found the attorney through a woman I'd worked with years ago, a colleague who had navigated her own family estate dispute after her mother passed. She didn't recommend someone aggressive. She recommended someone thorough. There's a difference, she told me, and she was right. The attorney's name was Sandra Pruitt. She had an office above a dry goods store on the main street of a town 40 minutes from mine, and she had been doing estate and property law for 26 years. Her waiting room had 2 chairs and a plant that had seen better days, and she offered me water from a pitcher on her desk, like I was a neighbour stopping by. I laid out the folder on her desk. She read through it without asking me to summarise. When she finished, she looked up and asked 3 questions, each one precise, each one aimed at something I hadn't thought to flag, but had documented without realising its relevance. That's what a good attorney does. They see the shape of what you've built before you can. She told me 2 things clearly. First, the pre-probate transfer was not yet complete. There were filing requirements that hadn't been finalised, and until they were, the transfer could be challenged on procedural grounds, particularly if there was evidence that the principal, my father, had not been fully informed of the implications at the time of signing. Sandra said the timing, 5 weeks before a stroke, was something a court would look at carefully. Not because it proved anything on its own, but because it raised a question about capacity and undue influence that deserved examination. Second, she told me that Bertrice's written account was valuable, not because it was legally decisive, but because it established a pattern. Courts don't always need a single dramatic piece of evidence. Sometimes they need a pattern, a consistent account of what happened, who was present, and what was said over time. That's what I had been building, without knowing I was building it. I left her office with a short list of next steps, and something I hadn't expected to feel walking in. Steadiness. Not confidence exactly, more like the specific calm that comes from understanding the actual dimensions of a problem. When something is vague, it feels enormous. When you can see its edges, it becomes manageable. That's what Sandra gave me that afternoon. Edges. I did not tell my father I had seen an attorney. I did not tell Renee. I did not change my behaviour in any visible way. I still called my father twice a week. I still brought groceries on Thursdays. I still asked about his physical therapy progress and whether the night nurse was working out. I gave nothing away, because there was nothing to give away yet. I was not performing normalcy. I was simply not finished. There was one more thing I needed, and it required a conversation I had been putting off for weeks. My father's oldest friend, a man named Howard, who had known my father since they were both young men working the same job site in 1974, had called me twice since the stroke. I hadn't called him back because I hadn't known what to say. Howard was not a complicated man. He was the kind of person who said what he saw and expected the same from others. He had been at my father's kitchen table more times than I could count. He had watched us grow up. I called him on a Tuesday evening. He picked up before the second ring. We talked for a while about my father's health, about the old days, about nothing in particular. Then Howard said, "I'm going to tell you something, Vivian, and I hope you won't be upset that I waited this long to say it." I told him to go ahead. He said that about 2 months before the stroke, my father had called him late on a weeknight, which was unusual, and said he wasn't sure he was making the right decisions about the property. He said he felt pressured, but didn't want to make trouble. He said he was tired. Howard said he sounded like a man who had been convinced of something he hadn't quite finished believing. I wrote that down too. The occasion was my father's 72nd birthday. Renee had organised it. That was the word she used when she called to tell me about it. Organised. Like it was a logistics problem she'd solved on everyone's behalf. A Sunday afternoon gathering at my father's house. Immediate family plus a few of his oldest friends. A catered spread from the place in town he'd always liked. A cake from the bakery on 5th. She said it in the tone she reserves for announcements that aren't quite invitations. She said she hoped I could make it. I said I wouldn't miss it. I arrived early. Not aggressively early, just enough to help set up, which is what I had always done, and which Renee had always allowed because it was useful. Howard was already there when I pulled up, sitting on the front porch with my father, the two of them talking the way old men talk when they're comfortable, slow and unhurried, full of long pauses that don't need filling. My father looked better than he had in weeks. The morning light was good on him. I kissed his cheek, and he held my hand for a moment longer than usual, which I noted and didn't say anything about. The other guests arrived by 2 o'clock. My father's neighbour from down the road, a couple from their church who had known my parents for 30 years, my father's younger brother and his wife who had driven in from 3 hours away, Renee's husband, and Renee, who moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who believes the room belongs to them. By 3 o'clock, everyone had plates, and the conversation had settled into the comfortable hum of a family gathering where nothing has gone wrong yet. I had spent the first hour being present and quiet, talking to my uncle's wife about her garden, refilling my father's water glass, listening more than speaking. Renee had noticed me doing this, and I could see her trying to read it, that slight narrowing behind her eyes that meant she was calculating. It was Howard who opened it. I want to be clear about that. I had not asked him to. I had told him what I knew and what I intended to do, and I had not scripted anything beyond that. What Howard did, he did because he was a man who had known my father for nearly 50 years and had his own feelings about what he'd witnessed. He was standing near the fireplace with my father's brother when he said, loudly enough for the room to hear without quite performing it, "Tom, I've been meaning to ask you something. Did you ever get that property situation sorted out the way you wanted?" The room didn't stop, but it slowed. My father looked up from his chair. His expression moved through something I couldn't fully read. "We're working on it," he said. "Renee's been handling it," Renee said from across the room, smooth and immediate. "It's all taken care of." "Is it?" Howard said. Not aggressive, just curious. The way an old man asks a question he already knows the answer to. I set down my glass. I said, "Actually, there are a few things that aren't quite settled yet." I kept my voice the same temperature as the rest of the conversation. "Sandra Pruitt has been reviewing the transfer documents. There are some procedural questions about the filing timeline and about the circumstances under which the documents were signed." Renee's husband looked at her. She was still composed, but her stillness had changed in quality. "This isn't the place," Renee said. "You organised the gathering," I said. "I'm just here the way you invited me to be." My father's brother said, "What transfer documents?" And that was the moment. Not dramatic, not a single revelation dropped like a hammer. Just a question from a man who hadn't known there were documents to ask about, hanging in the air of my father's living room, while the birthday cake sat on the counter, and the afternoon light came through the curtains, and everyone who mattered was in the same room for the first time in months. I said, calmly, Dad's property was being moved into a pre-probate transfer structure that was initiated before his stroke. I have the filing dates. I also have a written account from Bertrice describing a meeting she witnessed 6 weeks before the stroke and a conversation Howard had with Dad around the same time. I looked at my father. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to have the full picture in a room where people who love you can hear it. My father looked at Renee. That look. I will carry it for the rest of my life. Not anger. Something older and quieter than anger. The look of a man recalibrating something he had chosen not to see clearly. Renee said, Dad, I did everything you asked me to do. You know that. He also told Howard he felt pressured, I said. 2 months before the stroke, late on a weeknight. His words were that he wasn't sure he was making the right decisions. The church couple had gone very still. My uncle's wife set down her fork. Renee looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something behind her composure that I recognized. Not guilt, not quite. More like the specific fear of someone who has built a careful structure and is watching it develop a crack they can't locate quickly enough to fill. She said, You have no idea what I sacrificed to be here for him. I know exactly what you sacrificed, I said. I also know what I did. The difference is, I wasn't keeping a running tab on what it entitled me to. My father said, quietly, to no one in particular. I didn't know she felt pressured. The room was very still. I know, Dad, I said, and I meant it. My father asked Sandra Pruitt to review everything the following week. He did it himself, without Renee's involvement, which was the first independent decision I had seen him make in months. The pre-probate transfer was halted. The estate documents went back into review. That process took 4 months, and I won't pretend it was clean or simple, because it wasn't. There were hard conversations. There were weeks of silence between Renee and me that may never fully close. But here is what I want to tell you about the ending, because it isn't what I expected. My father called me on a Thursday evening in April. No particular reason, just to talk. We stayed on the phone for 40 minutes discussing nothing important. His physical therapy, a book he'd been reading, whether the old oak near the back fence needed to come down. At the end, he said, I should have talked to you more, about all of it. I said, yeah, you should have. He said, I know. That was all. No grand apology, no rewriting of history. Just a man in his 70s admitting something true, and a daughter deciding that was enough to work with. The property stayed in the estate, split evenly. I didn't need the land. I needed to know I had been counted. Turns out, those are very different things. I spent 31 years being the one who almost made the cut. The one who showed up, did the work, and got managed out of the room anyway. What changed wasn't my family. What changed was my willingness to be quiet about it. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, subscribe. This story isn't over.